Most people think respect disappears because of betrayal, because of arguments, because of mistakes. But that isn't usually where it begins. The shift often starts somewhere quieter, somewhere almost invisible. It begins the moment one person slowly becomes emotionally necessary. Not loved. Necessary. And those are not the same thing. The frightening part is that emotional dependency rarely announces itself. It arrives disguised as affection, disguised as commitment, disguised as closeness. Until one day you notice something uncomfortable. Your mood depends on their attention. A message from them can improve your entire evening. Their silence can quietly destroy it. And that's usually where the balance starts changing. Because the person who needs the connection more often feels it first. They start checking their phone more often, rereading conversations, wondering if the tone changed, analyzing pauses that never used to matter. A few extra minutes without a reply suddenly feels longer than it should. Not because anything happened, because uncertainty happened. And uncertainty is where dependency grows. Most people don't notice the moment they stop being themselves. It happens gradually. You stop speaking naturally. You start speaking strategically. You think before sending simple messages. You rewrite things. Delete things. Wait before replying because you don't want to seem too eager. Then eventually you become someone watching the relationship instead of experiencing it. And most people don't notice the damage until much later. The strange thing about emotional dependency is that it doesn't make people feel stronger. It makes them feel fragile. Suddenly every interaction carries weight. Every reaction becomes information. Every small change feels important. You begin measuring your value through responses. Through enthusiasm. Through attention. Through how quickly someone notices your absence. And that is where something dangerous begins. Because once your emotional stability depends on someone else's behavior, you stop negotiating from confidence. You start negotiating from fear. Fear of losing them. Fear of becoming ordinary. Fear of becoming replaceable. Fear of discovering they don't need you as much as you need them. That fear changes people. Quietly. You start accepting things you would have rejected before. You tolerate inconsistency. You lower expectations. You convince yourself certain behaviors don't bother you. Even when they do. Especially when they do. Because preserving the connection becomes more important than protecting yourself. And that's the part people struggle admitting out loud. The less dependent person doesn't always realize what is happening. Sometimes they aren't trying to gain power. Sometimes they simply feel less urgency, less anxiety, less pressure. They can miss a message without thinking about it. They can become distracted without panic. They can step away emotionally without feeling threatened. And that difference creates an atmosphere that both people can feel. Even if neither talks about it. Because respect has a strange relationship with necessity. People admire what can walk away. People rarely admire what feels unable to leave. That truth feels uncomfortable because everyone has experienced both sides. The side that feels desired. And the side that feels dependent. The difference between them is often invisible from the outside. But internally it feels enormous. One person enjoys the connection. The other person fears losing it. And eventually the emotional atmosphere changes completely. You can see it in small moments. The moments nobody discusses. They stop asking deeper questions. Conversations become updates instead of experiences. The curiosity starts fading. The excitement starts fading. The emotional tension starts fading. Not all at once. Just enough for you to notice. Then deny. Then notice again. You tell yourself you're imagining it. Until one night you're scrolling through old conversations looking for proof that things used to feel different. And that's usually because they did. Attention changes before love admits it. The painful part is how people respond to that realization. Most don't pull away. Most move closer. They try harder. Give more. Text more. Explain more. Accommodate more. They become emotionally louder trying to recover a reaction that once happened naturally. But effort doesn't always recreate fascination. Sometimes it exposes the absence of it. And that realization can be devastating. Because suddenly you're not trying to build connection. You're trying to restore it. You're trying to bring back a version of someone that existed months ago. A version that looked at you differently. Spoke to you differently. Noticed you differently. And that's where many people lose themselves. Not during heartbreak. Before it. When they begin reshaping themselves to avoid it. You start becoming easier. More available. More understanding. More patient. More forgiving. More accommodating. Not because that's who you are. Because you're afraid of what happens if you stop. The terrifying part is realizing how much your behavior is now controlled by their attention. A good morning text creates relief. A delayed reply creates anxiety. Basic affection starts feeling like a reward. And rewards become powerful when they are no longer guaranteed. That is why emotional dependency often feels addictive. Not because the person is extraordinary. Because access to them becomes uncertain. And uncertainty has a way of magnifying value. People notice absence faster than presence. That truth hurts because it keeps appearing everywhere. You see it when someone suddenly becomes distant. You see it when attention disappears. You see it when enthusiasm fades. The things people once overlooked suddenly become impossible to ignore. A reply that arrives 6 hours later. A conversation that feels forced. A laugh that sounds less genuine. A distracted expression while you're talking. Someone scrolling while you're explaining something important. Tiny moments. Tiny wounds. Tiny signals. Each one difficult to prove. Each one impossible to forget. And eventually a darker realization arrives. Sometimes you don't miss the person. You miss the version of yourself that existed when they couldn't get enough of you. The version that felt desired. Important. Interesting. Chosen. That's the realization that catches people off guard. Because what they're grieving isn't always the relationship. Sometimes they're grieving the loss of emotional significance. The loss of impact. The loss of psychological presence in someone else's world. And that's a much deeper loneliness. You begin noticing things that never used to bother you. How quickly they reply to other people. How alive they sound around strangers. How easily they offer attention elsewhere. How curiosity appears for others when it disappeared for you. No confrontation. No betrayal. Just comparison. Silent comparison. The kind that happens entirely inside your own head. And once that comparison starts, confidence begins eroding. Slowly. You start questioning things you never questioned before. Your attractiveness. Your value. Your uniqueness. Your importance. The frightening part isn't that someone changed. It's how quickly their change starts changing you. You become more careful. More self-conscious. More reactive. You begin anticipating disappointment before it arrives. And eventually you stop recognizing your own behavior. That's when emotional dependency becomes visible. Not because you need them, because you've started abandoning yourself. For many people, respect disappears long before the relationship ends. Not because affection vanished, because imbalance appeared. One person became emotionally responsible for the atmosphere. One person became responsible for maintaining momentum, for maintaining conversation, for maintaining closeness, for maintaining excitement. And carrying that responsibility eventually becomes exhausting. You notice you're always reaching first, always asking first, always initiating first, always sustaining the emotional energy. And one day a thought appears that refuses to leave. What happens if I stop? What happens if I stop trying? What happens if I become silent too? The answer often terrifies people, because deep down they already know. They fear discovering their absence no longer changes anything. That fear keeps them participating in relationships that have already emotionally shifted. That's the part nobody wants to say aloud. Many people aren't afraid of losing someone. They're afraid of finding out they've already lost their importance. And that realization feels unbearable. Because importance is addictive. Being noticed is addictive. Being wanted is addictive. Especially after becoming accustomed to it. The less dependent person doesn't always possess greater character, greater intelligence, greater emotional depth. They simply possess something that appears powerful. The ability to survive emotional distance. And whether people admit it or not, independence carries psychological weight. Not because it demands respect, because it doesn't chase it. The moment someone senses that your entire emotional world depends on their reactions, something changes. Not always consciously, not always intentionally, but something changes. The atmosphere shifts, the balance shifts, the perception shifts. And eventually the relationship begins operating under different emotional laws. That's why the most painful relationships are often not the ones filled with conflict. They're the ones filled with uncertainty. The ones where affection still exists, but leverage has moved. The ones where conversations continue, but enthusiasm fades. The ones where you're still together, yet somehow feel increasingly alone. Because loneliness inside a connection feels different. More confusing. More humiliating. More difficult to explain. You're sitting beside someone while secretly mourning the way they used to look at you. And that kind of loneliness leaves a mark. The cruelest part is how quietly it happens. No dramatic ending. No obvious collapse. Just gradual adaptation. Gradual emotional distance. Gradual normalization. Until one day you realize something unsettling. You spent so much time trying to remain important to someone else, that you stopped noticing how much importance you had already surrendered. And by then, the shift is usually complete. The less dependent person rarely announces their power. They don't need to. It exists in the silence. In the absence of urgency. In the ability to leave the phone untouched. In the ability to walk away from uncertainty without chasing clarity. And whether people admit it or not, that is often where respect begins. Not with control. Not with dominance. Not with words. With the simple fact that one person's emotional survival no longer depends on another person's attention. Because attention changes. Affection changes. People change. And sometimes the most unsettling realization is discovering how much of your identity was quietly built around being noticed by someone who gradually stopped looking. If this felt uncomfortably familiar, subscribe for more psychological explorations of human behavior.